Hey, welcome to Section 4. So things are getting pretty exciting, at least for us. We've got a fully functioning, tested smart contract. Anyone who wants to use our smart contract, though, may not be feeling the love. In this section, we're going to fix that by building a user interface that will serve as the final component for our decentralized application using React. In the first video for this section, we're going to get the data from our smart contract when the page loads. This is a great primer for our React app if you're not familiar with React. When I first started using React and Redux, the hardest part for me was understanding where everything was at, especially when different guides and tutorials use different layouts. So let's take a second and look at the pattern that I use, then we'll dig into writing some code. We'll be working out of the source folder for these videos. It's where all the code needed by our React application is written. Inside of it, we'll be using the containers folder and the core folder. The containers folder has the code for our React components, the things you see rendered on the page, like the merchandise view page, which displays the items for sale, and the claim funds page, which allows sellers to claim the proceeds of their sales. The core folder contains the code used by Redux for state management. We have an actions folder for responding to actions taken by the users of our app, and the reducers folder that listens for changes to the Redux store. The mapping between actions and reducers is defined in this file, types.js. So our homepage initially looks like this. It's pretty empty. Our job is to wire up the name of our item, the description, the price, the shipped, and the received status. We'll do that by setting the properties of those elements to the respective elements in the Redux store passed in as properties. To do that, we're relying on a function called component-will-receive-props. This is a function inside of our component class that gets called when a component receives new properties. When the page loads, we don't initially have a Web3 provider. The Web3 provider is a library that allows us to communicate with the Ethereum network via the user's browser. We're going to cover web3.js and learn how we inject it with MetaMask in 2 more videos. So for now, let's just focus on the fact that we don't have a Web3 provider, but MetaMask injects one. That's going to trigger a change in the properties, so the component will receive props function gets called. Now that function can get called for any number of reasons, not just because our properties changed. So when it gets called, we're going to specifically look to see if the Web3 provider changed, and if so, we'll call getAvailableItems, another function that we've defined in this component class. That's going to dispatch an action that makes a call to the Ethereum network and our smart contract to call the getItem function. So that line, actions.merchandise.getItem0, I said that gets dispatched, and that happens here at the bottom of our class in a function called mapDispatchToProps. It returns an action object with a merchandise object attached that binds to the action defined in our core actionsmerchandise.js file. So let's pause right there, jump into our code editor, and wire that part of it up. Then we'll move over into our Redux actions to interact with our smart contract on the Ethereum network. So I'm going to start by going into the containers folder, merchandise view, and opening index.js. This is the JavaScript file that renders our merchandise view or the home page for our app. I'm going to scroll down until I get to component-will-receive-props, and this is where we'll add our code that loads the available items from the smart contract when it detects that the Web3 provider has been injected. So we'll add that in and then move down to our function getAvailableItems, where we'll add our code that reaches out to the smart contract through our Redux actions. And then while we're here, let me show you this actions.merchandise item here. I said it was all the way down at the bottom where we have this special function mapDispatchToProps, and inside of it we have actions, merchandise, and then this bindActionCreators function that binds merchandise creators to a dispatch function. And this merchandise creators is actually defined up at the top right here, which gets imported from our core actionsmerchandise file. Okay, so all of that work in our component class ultimately led to calling an action named getItem. That's this guy right here from our actions-merchandise.js file. There's a lot going on here, so let's break it down one chunk at a time. First, we're returning an anonymous function that has two parameters, dispatch and getState. Inside of it, we get the Web3 provider object. This comes from the provider that we've stored in our application state. Remember just a minute ago, back when we used component will receive props to see when MetaMask injected our Web3 provider? That's this guy right here. And we're getting it from our state so we can use it here. It's going to allow us to talk to the Ethereum network and interact with our deployed contract. Next, we get the ABI, or the Application Binary Interface code for our contract. That's a JavaScript version of our contract that lets us know what properties and functions are exposed in our contract that we can interact with. We'll call the setProvider method of that and specify that it needs to use the current provider object in the Web3 provider to talk to the Ethereum network. Then we can set the default from account to the default account in the Web3 provider, because remember, we can have multiple accounts on an Ethereum network, and this is going to specify which one to use. Talking to contracts on the Ethereum network happens asynchronously, and most of the time there's going to be some time delay, so we wrap all of that communication in a promise. This promise won't get resolved until we either receive our data back or we get an error back. Based on whether we receive our transaction or an error, we'll call dispatch item retrieved or dispatch item retrieved failed. Let's take a look next at this code, getItemFromContract. It's a function defined in this same file, actions-merchandise.js, and it's the one that's actually going to handle the communication with our Ethereum contract. This function receives the merchandise contract we were just using as a parameter, as well as the ID of the item we want to retrieve from the contract, and two additional functions, resolve and reject. These are functions provided by our promise that we use to let the promise know when we've completed our work and whether it was successful or not. So our merchandise contract had the setProvider method that we use to set the injected Web3 provider, and it has this deployed method that says, hey, how about you take that Web3 provider and go get the version of this contract that's deployed out on the Ethereum network. The deployed method is a promise as well, so we use .then to say when you're finished, execute this function. And this function is the actual Solidity function out on our smart contract. When that returns, we check the results returned, and if we received a transaction back, we call the resolve function passed to us by the original promise and return the transaction. If we receive an error back, we call the reject function and return the error message. Assuming that was successful, we're going to call dispatch item retrieved. So let's take a look at that code. Dispatch item retrieved uses the Redux dispatch method to return the type item retrieved and includes the transaction as well as a key named success set to true. So what we've done here is dispatch this object into the Redux store. It took us a couple of steps to get there, but this is the end result. Let's jump over to our code editor and add this code in. Then we'll build our reducer that listens for this to update. This time I'm going to go into the core folder, the actions subfolder, and open actions-merchandise.js. The first function that I'll add is the getItem function that we call from our component will receive props function. Inside of that promise, it's going to call getItemFromContract, so let's add that. And then finally, we need to add our function dispatchItemRetrieved. And so we'll add it right here just above getItem. And then there's a specific order that I lay these out in here as well. Let me show you what I'm doing there. The way I like to lay this out is I put all of my exported functions at the bottom of the file. At the top, I put the functions that get called from those exported functions, and then in between those two, I have all of my dispatch events. That's just the way that I do it, so I know where to find them. You're welcome to come up with your own pattern that works best for you. So our last step in the action was to dispatch an action type. In this case, we dispatched the action type item retrieved. For our reducer, we're just going to build a switch statement based on that action type. When we receive an action type that we're interested in, like say item retrieved, we can do something with it. The something we're going to do is assign an object to the application state. In this case, our contract getItem function returned an array containing the details of an item from the online marketplace. We'll map each element from that array to a key name in the object that we're going to return, which takes us full circle because notice that we're returning an object named merchandise to the application state, which is this merchandise object used to set the properties of our elements on our rendered web page. Let's jump into our code editor one last time for this video and add our reducer. So this time we'll go into the core folder and reducers and then open reducer merchandise.js. And we've got our exported function merchandise reducer with our switch statement. So we'll just add the case for item retrieved in that statement, which returns our merchandise object. Well, if that felt like a lot for one video, it was. But don't stress out if visions of contracts, Redux, React, and reducers are swirling around in your head.